The results are in. Let's find out who is behind the mask. The first contestant was Mouse. The choices you had were Mr. Brownbill, Mrs. Pickard, Mrs. Carter, or Mr. Taylor. The answer was Mr. Taylor. Our next contestant was Octopus. The choices were Mr. Stainton, Miss Davy, Mr. Brownbill, or Mrs. Taylor. The answer was Mr. Brownbill. Next up, you have Monkey. Now, who was behind the monkey mask? The choices were Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Stainton, Mr. Toon, or Miss Summers. The answer was Mr. Stainton. Next, we have the Rainbow Unicorn. Now, was this Miss Orton, Mr. Durkin, Miss Hardy, or Mrs. Hollis? It was Miss Hardy. Then we had Panda. The choices you had were Mrs. Hardy, Mrs. Sullivan, Miss Taylor, or Mr. Toole. Behind the panda was Mrs. Hardy. Our next reader was Rabbit. Now, was Rabbit Mrs. White, Mrs. Stocks, Mr. Toole, or Mrs. Hollis? It was Mrs. Stocks. Then we had Cat. Was Cat Miss Davy, Miss Taylor, Mrs. Hadley, or Miss Langton? It was Miss Langton. Our next contestant is Pig. Is it Mrs. Taylor, Mrs. Goodhue, Mrs. Sullivan, or Mrs. Stocks? It is Mrs. Sullivan. Next up, we have Shark. Was Shark Mr. Durkin, Mr. Verglendutch, Mr. Stainton, or Mr. Toon? It was Mr. Durkin. Next up, we have Giraffe. Was Giraffe Miss Summers, Mr. Taylor, Miss Patel, or Miss Davy? It was Miss Patel. Then we had Fox. Was Fox Miss Conroy, Miss Taylor, Miss Orton, or Mrs. Hadley? It was Miss Taylor. Our final contestant was Giraffe. Was Giraffe Mr. Durkin, Mrs. Sullivan, Mrs. Goodhue, or Mr. Toole? It was Mr. Toole.